What a day for Canon shooters, especially for filmmakers, because Canon has announced two major things today. Number one is the official announcement of an upcoming firmware update for the Canon C70 that enables it to shoot internal RAW. The other thing was obviously the release of the EOS R5C, a better version of the EOS R5, now dedicated for video shooters with a lot of really cool features for video. So now it's really tough to decide between the two, the EOS R5C or the Canon C70. So in this video, I want to just give you my opinion of the differences between the two cameras and which is better for whom. And this is going to be a tough one. My name is Damien Cooper and welcome to Monkey Pixels. Right off the gate, if you're a hybrid shooter that needs a camera that does both stills as well as video, then obviously the EOS R5C is the perfect camera for you because the C70 doesn't shoot stills. So in this video, I will only focus on all of the video features and will only compare the video features of the two cameras. Let's start with the pricing. The Canon C70 comes in at $5,500 US, whereas the EOS R5C comes in at $4,500. So that is a difference of $1,000. So keep that in mind when I'm talking about the whole thing, that if money is a sensible subject, then you need to factor that in when I'm comparing both cameras. Let's start with the body and the design. I think the Canon C70's body is still better suited for video. It's a bigger camera and it just made for video, whereas the EOS R5C, although a little bit bigger than the EOS R5, is still pretty much a stills camera. So in my opinion, the point goes to the Canon C70, and I would overall prefer the body of the Canon C70 for smaller things. We do have a full HDMI port. We also have a couple more buttons. It's again more comfortable in your hand. It does have a side strap if you're shooting handheld. And overall, I think that the ergonomics of the Canon C70 are just a little bit better than the ones on a Canon EOS R5C. A really big factor contributing to this is that the Canon C70 does have dedicated buttons on the back of the camera to adjust your audio levels, whereas the EOS R5C doesn't have any, and you need to go into the menu and change those, and that is definitely a hassle. So if you're shooting on a run and gun project, you're shooting a wedding or you're shooting a documentary, I think it's way more comfortable to have physical buttons that you can quickly adapt to changing situations, whereas with the EOS R5C you do have to go with the touchscreen into the system, and that I don't like at all. Another thing I really appreciate about the Canon C70, as since I'm shooting a lot with the top handle, I'm shooting a lot of low angles, it does have a dedicated recording button on the left hand side of the camera, whereas the EOS R5C has no buttons on the left side whatsoever. Next up on our list is the resolution. Obviously, the EOS R5C shoots 8K, whereas the C70 only shoots 4K. So that is a massive step up in resolution when it comes to the EOS R5C. If that is necessarily a good thing, that is another question, because A, it's really hard to handle 8K files right now, and the Canon RAW files from the EOS R5 were basically uneditable, even on the newest computers, the M1 Max and M1 Pros. So overall, is that really a codec that you want to be shooting, especially because it's huge file sizes and you can only go up to 8K 50 or 60 if you use external power solutions. So technically, yes, it's cool to have 8K, but how usable that 8K RAW really is, we'll have to see and we'll have to find out. So overall, I prefer a really nice and good looking 4K that I can easily edit and has manageable file sizes compared to a huge 8K sensor that I can't really use anyway. Next up, and this is a really big factor, is the dynamic range, because I think dynamic range is one of the biggest factors contributing to a high professional and cinematic image when it comes to a cinema camera. Unfortunately, the EOS R5's dynamic range just isn't good. Looking at the advertised 14 stops of dynamic range compared to the C70's 16 to 17 stops of dynamic range, we can see that there's a gap of about 2 to maybe even 3 stops of dynamic range. And overall, I think that this is a big factor contributing to me probably leaning towards the C70 over the EOS R5C. Another point that I would definitely give to the EOS R5C is the card slots, because I prefer a CF Express Type B card over the small SD cards. Not only is the CF Express card bigger and you can go up to 2 terabytes if you want to, but it's also a lot faster. So when transferring all of the footage that you shot in a day over to your hard drives, it just takes up less time than doing this on the SD cards that the Canon C70 has. Of course, the Canon C70 has a dual card slot with 2 cards in it where you can simultaneously record to both cards at the same time, and you do have the same cards, whereas you do have an SD card as well as a CF Express card in the EOS R5C, and you only have one CF Express Type B card. But overall, I still prefer having a CF Express card over any SD cards any day of the week. Another big advantage of the EOS R5C compared to the C70 is that it features a full frame sensor compared to the Super 35 sensor of the C70. Me personally, I like shooting on Super 35 because I can use all my Super 35 glass and all the cine lenses, but since the EOS R5C has a cropped mode and you can actually switch to Super 35, that's not really an advantage of the C70. Of course, you can use a speed booster and that makes the Canon C70 almost full frame, but then you're limited to EF glass, whereas on the R5C, you can basically use all the lenses that you want, RF or EF, with a full frame sensor. Another thing I want to mention is the DGO sensor versus the dual ISO of the R5C. I think it's a pretty cool feature to include a dual ISO sensor on the EOS R5C, but me personally, I still prefer a DGO sensor over dual ISO. I'm pretty sure you will get a much cleaner image at ISO 3200 of the EOS R5C compared to the C70. For me personally, I don't really shoot a lot on high ISO values, and overall I just prefer having a gradual increase of noise so that I really know where I'm at and I can quickly make these decisions and just gradually increase my ISO as I need to, and don't constantly have to question if I should now switch to the dual ISO of the ISO 3200 or if I should keep it at ISO 800, because I had that with the Pocket 6K and Pocket 4K and it's overall just an inconvenience. Again, if you shoot at that high ISO range, then it's much cleaner and it's nicer, but I oftentimes find myself shooting anywhere in between 800 and 3200, and then I'm constantly on this fence of where I should be, if I should go to the higher ISO or the lower ISO. So just for convenience purposes, I prefer the DGO. Another thing, and that is just pure speculation, is that when I compared the C70, the C300 Mark III and the EOS R5 in high ISO values, the C70 and the C300 Mark III and its DGO sensor were just much better at retaining colors at high ISO values, whereas the EOS R5 completely broke down the colors and they switched, as well as the white balance. That is just true for the EOS R5, and I haven't tested the EOS R5C when it comes to that yet, but keep that in mind that it was an issue on the EOS R5 and it might also be on the EOS R5C. And here's another big one, and that is pretty much tied to the things that make me want to get the C70 over the EOS R5C alongside the dynamic range, and that is the internal ND filters. Internal ND filters for run and gun, but also for commercial work, is such a big factor when it comes to the style of filmmaking that I do. Whereas on the EOS R5C, you don't have any internal ND filters. Yes, of course, you can use matte boxes, you can use screw-on filters, or you can use an adapter between the sensor and the lens and get some drop-in ND filters, but all of these solutions are always kind of going along with some kind of limitations or compromises. I'm using matte boxes on a couple of my cameras. I also use some drop-in ND filters, screw-in filters, magnetic filters, but overall, nothing compares to having internal ND filters with the convenience as well as the quality. Another point I would probably give to the R5C is the autofocus. Judging by the R5 versus the C70's autofocus, it's mostly better in almost every situation. It has eye detect autofocus, which the C70 doesn't have, and from using both cameras for a while, I think the R5's autofocus is just locked on better, it's more responsive and overall more reliable.
Hold on.
By now you might have already seen the video that I uploaded about the EOS R5C where I talked about the cripple hammer, and if you haven't, well, the cripple hammer is about the autofocus. Whereas the EOS R5 had a dual pixel autofocus 2, the Canon C70 only utilizes dual pixel autofocus 1, and apparently the EOS R5C when shooting video also only uses dual pixel autofocus 1. So that leads to the conclusion that the autofocus should be on par with the Canon C70 and not superior, which I thought it would be. So the point probably doesn't go to the EOS R5 and it's more of a wash. And in my opinion, that also sways us a little bit more towards the C70 when shooting video. Another really cool feature of the Canon C70 is the face-only autofocus, and I'm not 100% sure if the R5C will now get that feature as well, since it does have the same menu as the Canon C70. The EOS R5 didn't, and that is a feature that is really cool for recording these talking heads or when shooting interviews for clients. Another difference between the two cameras is the way you record audio. On the Canon C70 you have two mini XLR ports, you have a 3.5mm headphone jack, you have timecode, and as I already mentioned when I talked about the body, you have dedicated knobs on the back of the camera to adjust your audio levels. Whereas with the EOS R5C you only have a 3.5mm headphone jack and, really cool, a new addition of timecode. With the new hot shoe on the EOS R5C you can now use an XLR module or some dedicated XLR microphones that you can use with the camera, which is obviously a great addition and a great step up. For my style of shooting it probably won't work because I usually use a cage with a top panel and external monitor on top, and I don't really see how this module will fit the camera when I have it rigged out. So overall I'm not 100% sure if this actually will work, and if shooting run and gun, I don't think that the XLR module is a great option for you. Another minor concern I have about the timecode port on the EOS R5C is that it might get in the way of a cage and that this might limit our rigging potential, but that we will have to see in the future. But overall I think the point for overall audio solutions definitely goes to the Canon C70. Last on our list is our battery solutions, and this point obviously goes to the C70 because we have more choices when it comes to batteries, and we also have bigger batteries in general and therefore have a lot more power. Another really cool feature that I talked about in my Canon C70 rig video that I will link up here is that you have the option of using some special kind of batteries that not only have a D-tap out but also a USB out. So with these batteries we can power our camera, an external monitor, and also another accessory. We don't have any of these options with the EOS R5C, and the batteries are a lot smaller, so we don't have that much juice to power our camera opposed to the Canon C70. So now what's my personal overall verdict of the Canon C70 versus the EOS R5? Me personally, I still prefer the Canon C70 over the EOS R5C any day of the week, and I would always take the C70 for its internal ND filters and the dynamic range alone. I also think it's a little bit more convenient to rig out, to shoot with, the battery solution. Overall, it's just a camera that is more tailored towards video shooters. Obviously, when shooting stills is an option for you, then the EOS R5C is the way to go. And if you shoot a lot on gimbals and autofocus is a must for you, the R5C might also be the better option for you, because clearly the autofocus is better on the EOS R5C. It's also a smaller and lighter camera that makes gimbal work a little bit more convenient and easy. But if you're a dedicated video shooter, then I think the 8K of the EOS R5C and the autofocus are factors that are not big enough to sway me towards an EOS R5C and not take the Canon C70. I hope this video gave you an overview of the Canon C70 versus the EOS R5C. Also, I gave you my opinions on why I think that some things matter more than others, and my overall opinion which camera I would take. If you like this video, then please give it a like, subscribe for more, because I might actually do more comparisons of the Canon C70 versus the EOS R5C. I will also do a full review on the EOS R5C in the near future. And with that, I hope to see you on the next one.